Morgan, are you there? Morgan Hargrave?
Yes, sir. I'm here.
Can you take over as co-host, please?
Yes.
Okay. And you can hear me and see me?
Yes, sir.
And can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Is this better?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to talk about a lot of things today. You might make a note that what you just listened to was a song called Gimme Shelter, and it is generally considered to be one of three songs that are generally identified with the Vietnam War. It's by the Rolling Stones. The one I gave you the other day was a song called Fortunate Son by the Creedence Clearwater Revival, CCR. And I'll play another one for you on Thursday that's going to be called All Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix. And those three songs are generally considered to be the songs that are most identified with the Vietnam War. There's lots of other songs too, but these three songs are almost any film that you see that was made back in the 70s or the 80s about Vietnam, you will notice that one of those songs will be played. So that's the second of the ones. Today we're going to bring the Americans into this war. We have been advisors until now. I did talk to you the other day about the fact that the early advisory period, and then I talked about the American soldier to get you prepared for what you're going to be watching today as I talk about the role of the American soldier in this war. So the screen that you have up there right now says the era of big battles, the American soldier and the Vietnamese soldier. We've already talked about that. So I'm going to sort of take you out of that. You've already heard that. There's actually 57 slides today, but I will only use about 30 of them because I used about 25 of them the other day. So between now and next Thursday, I intend to complete the discussion of not only the Vietnam War, but also the legacy of the Vietnam War. So this is a 10-year period from 65 to 75. I say up here on the screen, the American war in Vietnam. And I say that because I do not want you to be confused about the fact that if you are in Vietnam, you don't call it the Vietnam War, you call it the American War in Vietnam, because Vietnam already fought the French War. Heck, they fought the Chinese for 1,000 years before that. So from the perspective of the Vietnamese, it is the American war in Vietnam from 1965 to 1973, when we'll sort of go home. And then by 1975, the war will be over in Vietnam because the communists will have taken over the country after America leaves in 1973. That'll all come together, hopefully today in this lecture. So I want to, first of all, give you an idea of where you are sitting at Texas Tech University and why we are so important in terms of the study of the war in Vietnam. The book that you read the other day, last night I Dreamed of Peace, and the book on which you will be examined in your final exam in a few weeks, The Diary of Dong Thuy Tram. You know about her. You know the story behind that book. The fact that we actually have the original Vietnamese diary of this woman in our archive here at Texas Tech. Pretty phenomenal that we would be so fortunate to have this wonderful document. I don't know how much I told you about this before, but I'll repeat again that we offered this entire diary to the family of Dong Thuy Tram when we brought them to Texas Tech. And they said, no, they would rather have us keep it and honor it here, protected here. We have it under glass. And the reason for that is they were afraid that if they took it home, that the communist government there would exploit them about the book. Now, Don Quy Tram is actually buried in Vietnam, but the book itself, her diary, on which this book that you read is based, exists here at Texas Tech University. This book is called Perfect Spy, The Incredible Double Life of Pham Xuan An, Time magazine reporter and Vietnamese communist agent, written by Larry Berman. Now, for any of you that had a chance to listen to Larry Berman's lecture last Friday night as part of our conference on Vietnam, you know about Larry. So I'll tell you a little bit about this book. There was a man by the name of Pham Xuan An, and he was literally a man who came to America in about 1956, 1957. He was sent here as a spy by the communist government, and he enrolled in Orange County Community College in California, and then he eventually worked for the Sacramento Bee, which was a newspaper in Sacramento, as a reporter, learned the language, fell in love with an American girl. Pham Xuan An was someone that spied on America while working for Time magazine, and then reported to his people the kinds of things that America was planning on doing in the war itself. I did never have a chance to meet Pham Xuan An, but some of my colleagues and students did. When we went on study abroad, we always met with Pham Xuan An, and after the war was over, he was declared a great hero of the communist government, that he was in part responsible for their victory over America and over South Vietnam. And then one of those things that sort of strangely happens when wars end, he was never allowed to come back to America. His government didn't trust him, even though he spied for them. And he was never allowed to come back to America. And in the process of not coming back to America, he sent his kids here to go to school. His son actually graduated from University of North Carolina Law School. And when George Bush, 43, became the first United States president to return, the first United States president to go to Vietnam as president of the United States, his interpreter was Pham Xuan An's son. So Pham Xuan An died back in, I believe, about 2010 or so. And he died saying that he loved America and he loved his country. Those were the two countries that he loved the most. So we at Texas Tech have sort of sponsored the idea of Pham Xuan An. Even though we didn't publish his book, we know a lot about him, and all of his records and his papers and everything are here at Texas Tech. And then there's this guy's book. You might recognize the author of this book. It happens to be me. That is not me on the cover of the book, but I did my research for this book here at Texas Tech. I published this book in 2009, and the paperback version of it came out in 2012. It's called Not a Gentleman's War. It's based on not my experiences, even though it says an inside view of junior officers in the Vietnam War. That is not true. That it was not it's an inside view, but it's not my memoir. That's yet to be written. So today I want to talk to you about the Americans in the country. I've got a map up here that shows corps. I Corps, which starts at the top of the 17th parallel, which divides North Vietnam, Communist Vietnam, from South Vietnam. I've got the Corps itself, 2 Corps, which is the Central Highlands of Vietnam. And then I've got 3 Corps, which is down around Saigon. And then 4 Corps is what we call the Mekong Delta. So when you hear me talk about places in Vietnam, America divided it into military corps. That's the way we identified certain things happening within the country. You will also see Laos to the west, and then Cambodia. Those are all places that have an influence on the way this war was fought. So I'm going to talk now about what we refer to as the era of big battles. As I said the other day, we were very frustrated when we tried to just have an enclave strategy. The enclave strategy being the area around Da Nang, when we had our Air Force base there, and our Air Force base was put in the position of trying to bomb North Vietnam, and we allowed our Marines only to move out about 10 miles from the base. Today, I'm going to talk about what happens when we bring all of the troops in. So I'm going to, for one quick moment here, I'm going to have to leave for 30 seconds. I will be right back. Sorry for that. So the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley is the first big battle of the war. It is also the battle that you may know something about if you had ever watched a movie called We Were Soldiers, which was a Mel Gibson movie in which Mel Gibson plays a man by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore. This battle takes place in November 15 and 16 of November of 1965. And it takes place, let's see here, it takes place, if you can see it takes place right about there, just southwest, about maybe 80 kilometers southwest of a place called Pleiku. Now, I was stationed right here, much later in the war, 6 years later, after to be exact. But the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley is considered to be the most important and first big battle of the war. The unit that was involved is called the 1st Air Cav. I put their patch up on the screen last week. It's a yellow patch. This was the first time that American soldiers had gone into battle with the Huey helicopter being how they went into battle. And the second thing, it's also the first battle that takes place using a new weapon that the United States Army had adopted, the weapon being called the M16 rifle. Now, those of you that are gun people will also know that this is the weapon on which the current controversial weapon called the AR-15 is based. The AR-15 is a semi-automatic weapon in that you pull the trigger one time to shoot one bullet. This weapon, the M16, was fully automatic, and you could fire about 18 rounds in 1.5 seconds by pulling the trigger one time. So this is a huge battle. It's the first time that the United States military had actually fought against the People's Army of Vietnam. That is the PAVN troops that had come down from the north to engage American military on the ground. It will include air power called in by the United States. It will include helicopters putting us into battle. It will include gunships. The American soldiers are outnumbered by enemy soldiers. Probably, it's hard to know exactly, but somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 times. That is, the enemy had 6 to 7 times as many men on the ground as the American unit that was on the ground. The unique situation about this battle is that the Americans win the battle. The North Vietnamese communist troops lose the battle. But I argue that the losers learned more in losing than the Americans did in winning. And let me explain that. The battle takes place over a 2-day period, and the enemy soldiers outnumbering the Americans fight to almost to the last man. But the only way that the Americans were successful in winning this battle was to call in airstrikes, to call in air power by gunship helicopters, and in addition to that, to essentially use artillery right in on top of themselves. So what does that exactly mean? Well, it means that our technology helped win this battle. The enemy, and let me see if I've got the picture. We're led, of course, by this guy I talked about the other day. General William Westmoreland is the man in charge of all American soldiers. And General Giap is the man in charge of all the communist soldiers. So I'm going to introduce you to some new terms that you need to understand. By virtue of the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, the enemy decided, we don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to fight America's way. The Americans believed in our success that we could use air power, gunships, and not necessarily outnumber the enemy with our ground troops. We could win that way with technology and with air power. We began what we believed would be a successful effort in winning the war in Vietnam. It's called a war of attrition. The idea was that if we can kill enough of the enemy that they cannot replace those that we kill by sending them south from North Vietnam, we win. Killing became the main goal of the American units, hence the American soldier. So from this moment on, 70% of all of the enemy contacts were initiated not by the Americans, but by the enemy, by the People's Army of Vietnam, the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong. They're the ones that took the battle to America, but they took it in their own way. They said, never again will we commit large elements of our military, meaning never again will we commit thousands of troops. We'll commit hundreds of troops in small guerrilla actions. The Americans, we will try to entice the enemy into fighting big. They don't want to fight big, they want to fight small. So we initiated to know whether or not we were winning the war of attrition. We introduced what is called body count as the metric under which we will determine success. So what does that mean? Well, if you are a military historian or a military theorist, as I am, you know that great military theorists such as Karl von Clausewitz, such as Sun Tzu from China, these are names, you don't need to really know these for this course, but what they always taught as great military theory is killing the enemy is not as important as controlling the enemy. So we rejected that idea, and we believed that counting bodies was the metric for knowing whether or not we're being successful. So we actually, when you were all out on an operation, if you were in a 10-man squad or a 30-man platoon or a 150-man company or a 700-man battalion or all the way up to 5,000 of a division, whatever the size of your unit, the idea was to kill more of the enemy to kill as much of the enemy as possible. And when you have artillery and air power and helicopter gunships, you can do that. And then we would ask our men on the ground, our soldiers, whether they be Army or Air Force soldiers on the ground, we would ask them to count the bodies and report how many men were killed up through the chain of command. Well, that sounds reasonable, except that we took it one step further. And we decided, in addition to that, we'll not only count the bodies, we will incentivize body count. That is, we will reward the American soldier for how many enemy he kills. So a squad that's killed more enemy than his other squad within a platoon, or a platoon that killed more enemy than his adjacent platoon or company or whatever it was, you were rewarded by sending you to rest and relaxation locations within the country, to places like China Beach in Da Nang for a 3 or 4 day relaxation from combat. Well, here's what happens when you are rewarding body count. You are incentivizing men to cheat, to not always report exactly what happened. So a platoon kills 3 of the enemy soldier, and they have the bodies there, and they say, they get on the radio and they report to their company commander, we killed 3 enemy soldiers. And we think we killed about 7 because we see blood trails. Any of you that are hunters and you go deer hunting, you know that you can follow blood trails and you can see whether the deer went in a certain direction. Well, you can sort of do that with human beings too, as terrible as that sounds. So what we did was the platoon leader reports 3, but he thinks he got 7. It gets up to the company commander and he says, okay, 3 plus 7 is 10. I'll report 10 as KIAs, killed in action. And then the platoon leader decides, so the platoon leader has reported 10. The company commander says, well, let's see, if they got 10, I think I'll make that 15 because they probably got more than that. And he reports 15 up to the company commander, who reports 30 up to the battalion commander, who reports 90 up to the brigade commander. Everyone's cheating just a little bit. So at the end of the battle, we think we killed 3 and it's reported as 100 up to division headquarters. Now, why would someone do that? Well, you're incentivizing, you're allowing men to take R&R based on that body count, which may or may not have really happened. In addition to that, we created what we call free fire zones. Free fire zones. These were simply locations where we believed the enemy was hiding out in villages. So we went into the villages, friendly villages perhaps. We went into those villages and we said to the people in the village, we know that you are being told by the VC that you are to harbor us. We know that you're being told that you are to feed the enemy. We don't want you to do that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to move you to a more secure location than your village out here in the middle of this jungle. We're going to move you to a location along, in my case, it was along a place called Highway 14 that ran right down the middle of zone of the Second Corps Central Highlands. We're going to build you new homes along that highway. And we, the United States of America, will protect you with our American soldiers. And then we're going to say about your village, we're going to declare it to be a free fire zone, meaning that we assume that if there is ever a person, not an enemy, a person seen in your village from the time we move you out of your village, if we see a person in that village, we will assume they are an enemy soldier. And we will call in the world on your village. That is, we will fire artillery in there. We will fire air power in there. We will have men go out on operations. And if we see someone in the village, they're assumed to be an enemy soldier. Well, the problem with the creation of these free fire zones was that that village had been there for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. Grandpa and great-grandpa and great-great-grandpa and your relatives are buried in that village. And so what happened is we would move people away from their ancestral home to a highway location where we can protect them, but they didn't like being there. They wanted to be back in their ancestral home. So they would go back. And then 2 weeks later, if there was an operation or an aircraft flew overhead and saw people there, it was assumed they were the enemy, and we would call in artillery and bomb that village that was in a free fire zone. And of course, what that meant then was that those friendlies were actually now part of the body count, and they were assumed to have been an enemy soldier killed. Not a good way to run a war, but it was the way we ran this war. And therefore, there were some studies that said that we may have killed every man, woman, and child in North Vietnam 3 times. Whereas the truth of the matter is it wasn't that way. Not a good way to run a war. And in the wars of your generation, in Afghanistan and Iraq, you will seldom hear any American units report how many enemy they killed that day, because it's not an effective way of knowing whether or not you are doing it right, whether you are getting it done properly. Now, this next section, I'm not going to talk about this because I talked about it on Thursday of last week. So let me just rapidly run through these slides. And I'm going to tell you that from 1965 to 1968, for that 3-year period, America will be involved in battle after battle. We, the Americans, will win every single battle. We will win every single battle. That is, at the end of the day, we will control that land. We will have killed more of the enemy than they will have killed of Americans. We will have successfully won every battle, and we will go from about 150,000 men in 1965, when we first started all this, to 585,000 men on the ground and about 68,000 women. None of the 68,000 women will be in a combat role, but they will be in combat situations in rear echelon or as nurses in the hospitals. Not ever out of danger, but they will be there from 65 to 68. Now, the fact that we are winning every single battle will become known by the American people. And the inference of winning every battle, even though body bags are coming home, and we will have had killed in Vietnam by 1968, and I'm talking about January of 1968, in that almost three-year period, 65, 66, 67, in that three-year period, approximately 33,000 American men will have been killed, but always winning every battle. Now, you're going to see, as I talk around about the rest of this time, you're going to see that it didn't make any difference that we won every battle, because it's assumed by the American people that we are also winning the war. To win a war takes more than just winning battles. So in late 67, the leader of our military, General William Westmoreland, will come to America. And he will travel around America, going to places like the Chambers of Commerce. He'll go to the Detroit Economic Club, the Chicago Economic Club, and he will give speeches. And he will say, we are winning. We see the light at the end of the tunnel. The light at the end of the tunnel, meaning everything is fine in Vietnam. And then he returns to Vietnam. And on January 31st of 1968, all hell will break loose in Vietnam. In every single city and large villages, in fact, and I've got a map up here, every single one of these locations will be hit and attacked by the North Vietnamese communists and the South Vietnamese Viet Cong. Every single city will be hit. Our intelligence didn't give an indication that this was going to happen. It's called the Tet Offensive because Tet is the #1 holiday in Vietnam. It's also the #1 holiday in China, a lot of Asian countries. Tet is a time when people go home. If you live in Saigon and you were born in Hue and your family lives in Hue, you get on a bus and you go home and you celebrate Tet, Lunar New Year. It is the best way to explain it to Americans is to think about it being a combination of Christmas and New Year's, and probably the 4th of July too. It's a big, big deal. Children are let out of school. It's about a 2-week holiday usually. And you exchange gifts and you clean your house and you get new clothes and you do all of the things to help you give a good promise for the future. Well, on June 30th and 31st of 1968, all hell broke loose in Vietnam. And all of these cities were attacked. Even in Saigon, the United States Embassy, the safest place, the most secure place in all of Vietnam was not only attacked, but enemy Viet Cong soldiers held the US Embassy for a period of 6 hours. Imagine that. We had typists, clerks, having to pick up an M16 rifle and fight. It shocked the world. It shocked people back in the States so much so that we started questioning whether we were really winning. It was a terrible, terrible time. Now I have a picture on the screen that will bother you a lot, as it should. Just a few weeks after the Tet Offensive, at a place called My Lai, which is a place in I Corps, the map I had up there before, a unit called the AmeriCal Division sent some soldiers into a village after having used artillery because enemy soldiers were expected to be there. The AmeriCal unit, Charlie Company, went in about 8:30 in the morning. The intelligence, it was a Wednesday, and the intelligence said that all women and children would be gone because it was market day and they would have gone to market. The truth of the matter is that the women and children, that was bad intelligence. Now we can argue, I think, that the village was supportive of the Viet Cong. But that particular day, when the American soldiers went into the village, there were 0 enemy soldiers in the village. So the American soldiers, having what they perceived to be an order from their commanders, killed about 150 women and children and non-combatant men over the age of probably 65. It is considered to be the greatest one-day atrocity of American soldiers in history. What I'm showing you there is a sort of a drainage ditch where a lot of women and children went to escape from the Americans. And the Americans stood on the edge of that drainage ditch under the order of a lieutenant by the name of Lieutenant Calley, and fired down into the ditch and killed everything that moved. There was one, I would argue, hero, American hero. You can write his name down, actually. His name is Hugh Thompson, Hughthomson. Hugh Thompson was flying a Huey helicopter that had been the helicopter that inserted the American soldiers into what he perceived to be a combat situation. And as he was flying out, he noticed American soldiers shooting and killing women and children. And he actually landed his helicopter and confronted the platoon leader who had told his men to kill women and children. He confronted him and he said, if I or my men see any more American soldiers killing women and children, meaning non-combatants, I will order my men to start shooting American soldiers. Bottom line on this particular thing is the man that was charged, there were several men charged with murder. And one of them, and you can write his name down, but I don't mind if you forget it. His name is Lieutenant William Calley, C-A-L-L-E-Y. He was the platoon leader. He was charged with 100 counts of murder. as was his company commander. The company commander was found innocent, and Lieutenant Calley was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But President Nixon, by the time it came to trial, almost 2 years later, President Nixon commuted his sentence, and so he is now still alive and works in a jewelry store in Columbus, Georgia. Very tragic. I go back to My Lai almost, well, every time I take my students to Vietnam, we go to this place, and they have a museum there now and a statue honoring those that died there. And the saddest part about it is that as we walk through the village, which has all been rebuilt, of course, because the American Air Force, knowing what happened there, the American Air Force bombed the village to where it was not any longer even observable. And then the United States Army covered this massacre up for 18 months. And when it was finally discovered that it happened, that's when the trial and everything started. A very, very terrible time to be an American. Sadly, when I take my students there, this is a really difficult day because they've put in concrete walkways, and in the concrete walkways are the imprints of American soldiers' jungle boots. A tough day. So, we're now in March of 1968. President Lyndon Johnson goes on television on March 31st of 1968, and he is to report to the American people how we're doing in Vietnam. What he says is, we are doing much better than we were 2 months ago during the Tet Offensive. I think that we're doing really fine. And then he says to the American people, with American boys fighting and dying in the jungles of Vietnam, I cannot spend any time doing anything except being commander-in-chief. Therefore, I will not accept the nomination of my Democratic Party to run for president in 1968. In other words, he says, I'm out of here. Let somebody else do this. I'll finish my term, but that's it. I'm not going to run for re-election. Shocks everybody. No one can believe it. And if you happen to be the enemy, if you happen to be Ho Chi Minh running the war from the other side, you look at this and you say, oh my goodness, the leader of their country just quit. He just quit. I feel pretty good about the situation we find ourselves in. So I want you to think about 1968 now. This is a year, I actually teach a whole course at Texas Tech called 1968. That's how important it is. We've got the Tet Offensive having happened at the beginning of January. At the end of January. We've got My Lai, which we don't know about. We don't know about My Lai. I won't know about that for another 8 months. But we know it did happen in that period of time. And then 1968 happens in some really crazy ways. I have a picture here of 2 men standing side by side. Martin Luther King on my left, and Robert Kennedy on my right. Both of these men are going to lose their lives by assassins' bullets in 1968, and we can argue it all has an impact on Vietnam. It all has an impact on this terrible year of 1968. Martin Luther King will be shot in Memphis, Tennessee on April 7th, 1968, gunned down in Memphis. He is the leader of the civil rights movement in America. He is looked upon by American soldiers as their leader, and African-American soldiers in Vietnam, which I talked about on Thursday, are going to be devastated that here they are fighting for the freedom of Vietnamese in South Vietnam, and their leader is shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. A few months later, in California, in the middle of June of 1968, Robert Kennedy, who's running for president as an anti-war candidate, and the brother of the assassinated John Kennedy, who had been assassinated 5 years earlier in 1963, he is shot to death in California during the just at the end of as the beginning of the California primary, running for president. He no longer is a candidate because he is dead. And then this guy decides to run for president of the United States. Now let's think about this for a minute. Richard Nixon had lost the presidency 8 years earlier to John Kennedy, just by a few 100,000 votes. He had then run for governor of California, and he lost that too. In fact, in his election for governor, he says to the American people, "You don't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore." And he leaves the public eye. But he runs as a Republican. He runs as the peace candidate. He's going to end the war in Vietnam. He is a Republican, and he will run against the vice president of the United States under Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey. Now, Humphrey, being the vice president during this war, has the war around his neck. Whereas Richard Nixon says, "I've got a plan to end the war in Vietnam." And when people would say, "What is your plan, Mr. President?" he would say, "I can't tell you, it's a secret." He runs as the anti-war candidate. He is elected president in November of 1968. And in 1969, January 20th of 1969, he takes office. And his plan is to Vietnamize the Vietnam War. Now, if we're going to Vietnamize the American war, it obviously has been an American war. His idea is to get the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the Armed Forces of the Republic of Vietnam, our ally in South Vietnam, to take on a bigger, greater role in this war. So I'm going to put a couple of names up here for you. This is President Nguyen Van Thieu. He becomes the president of South Vietnam. He is elected by a huge majority in an election that probably was not completely fair and free. You remember last week I put up some pictures of the guys that kept creating coups, like Nguyen Van Thanh and Big Men. Well, Nguyen Van Thieu is the new president elected by the people. He has a vice president by the name of Nguyen Cao Ky, Air Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky, who he and Thieu are not really close to each other. It's not like in America where usually the vice president sort of likes the president. Not in this case. But America has been negotiating to end this war since about November of 1968. President Johnson, in his last days as president, agrees to negotiate the end of this war. And those negotiations are going to take place in a place called Paris, the Paris Peace Talks. I've got a couple of names up here that you do need to know. One of them is Le Duc Tho. and the other one is Henry Kissinger. Here they are. Le Depteux is a prime minister of the communist government, and Henry Kissinger at that time is the national security advisor to President Nixon. They will begin the negotiations to end the war in Vietnam. Now think about this. Those negotiations start in November of 1968 while President Johnson is the president. They end 5 years later when President Nixon is the president. So let's think about what's happening here. For about 6 months, the negotiations that take place, see if I've got a picture. Yeah, there's a picture. For about 6 months, the negotiations will be about the size and the shape of the table. For about 6 months, we talk about what the table ought to look like. Obviously, neither side is ready for serious negotiations when they start in 68. They will go on for an additional 5 years. The issue is not only the shape of the table, but who will sit around the table. The United States only wanted the PAVN to be at the table, and the communists wanted the National Liberation Front, the South Vietnamese, the Viet Cong to be at the table. So all these negotiations are going on about how to end the war in Vietnam. President Nixon, when he comes to power in January of 1968, he wants to leave. He wants to get out of Vietnam. He knows that this is a war that while we're winning every single battle, it's going to be virtually impossible to win the war itself. He knows that, and the problem is, how the hell does the United States get out of Vietnam? A war that we have been fighting, you can argue, since about 1955. So a war that we've been fighting for 13 years, and we'll fight for another 5. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to end this right now, and I'm going to pick it up on Thursday because I want to answer questions.
Yes, I have a question.
Claire.
Who's the name of the air marshal for the president of South Vietnam?
Yeah, his name is Nguyen Cao Ky, and you spell that Nguyen, and that's pronounced Nguyen, even though it says Ng, Nguyen, and then Cao, C-A-O, and then Ky, K-Y.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Let me see, Dominic.
Yes. You talked about the My Lai massacre? Yes.
My Lai. Mm-hmm.
Does that have any relations to the movie The Platoon?
Well, I'll tell you what it has. If you were in my class in room 104, I would have shown you a scene from the movie Platoon.
Okay.
And it would be the scene in the village. And have you seen the movie?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know that scene. I don't like that movie very much.
Yeah.
I think it really is a bad image movie of the American soldier, and I prefer We Were Soldiers more so in terms of showing what soldiers did in Vietnam. But that scene is very important. That movie was directed by a man by the name of Oliver Stone.
Yeah.
And Oliver Stone was a member of the 25th Infantry Division, which is the division that's shown in that movie. It takes place over in a province called Tay Ninh over on the Cambodian border. When I was in Vietnam in 2008, I believe it was, with my students, one of our guides that took us through My Lai sent me an email a few weeks later, and she said to me, there was a very important, famous man here last week since you were here, and his name was Oliver Stone, and he's making a movie about My Lai. It's called Pinkville.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And I thought, oh, this is terrible, because I knew if Oliver Stone's making a movie about My Lai, because
Yeah.
everything that I told you about My Lai takes place in 4 hours. 4 hours. No American is even wounded except one guy shot himself in the foot with a .45 pistol. And some argue that he probably did that so he didn't have to take part in it. But anyway, I didn't want that movie to be made. And consequently, Oliver Stone got interested in making a movie on George Bush, and he never made that movie, and I hope he never does. It's a terrible thing to see. There's a documentary on it that's pretty good. But fictional account of it, I don't know how you do that. But yes, it was the scene in Platoon. It's an indication, but not anything nearly as bad as what really happened.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else?
I got a question.
Who are we here? Where are we? Chris?
Chris. Yes.
Okay.
When you were talking about how like they incentivize killing to get relax and get R&R, did that also like sort of like turn soldiers like would that make them sort of into like focus on trying to get as many kills as possible? Like would that like make them a reason to like I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. I'm sorry.
No. You're asking a very good question in a way, because there is a school of thought that says that after 1968, after the Tet Offensive, American soldiers became very disenchanted with being there. And I didn't talk about this the other day too much in my lecture, but what happens is remember we talked about the 2S deferment. If you stayed in college, you could stay out of the war. Well, what happens in 1969 is the United States decides that drafting people is that exempting some men from battle because they happen to be in college is a bad idea. And so what we do is we start with what we call a lottery system, and we actually put names and we put birthdays in a big tube and rolled it and drew names out, and you were drafted based on your birthday. It was a lottery. As they always say, that what happened around college campuses with fraternity parties would be held the night of the drawing, and guys would watch to see if they were going to be drafted based on their birthday. And so we got more fair with it. But we also, by doing that, we drafted a lot of college educated and college guys that were in college but weren't doing well, and guys that were just drafted because of their birthday that had college experience. And a lot of guys went to Vietnam and started questioning their leadership. Why the hell am I taking this hill? If I'm taking this hill, you're going to give it back next week, which we did. It was never a war about geography. So the question you're asking is, did soldiers, when they were incentivized to kill, did they do the killing? Well, and sometimes they did, but sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they didn't understand why they were being told to do those things, and they started questioning their leadership. Remember, it's a drafty army. Unlike the armies of today where volunteers are all serving, this was a drafty army. So in a lot of ways, I think that's the question you're asking. Did it make soldiers into more aggressive killers, or did it make them into less? I would argue probably some of both. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Anyone else?
Hello, I wanted to clarify. You said
Byron.
January and June for the date of the Tet Offensive. Was it January or June?
January 30th and 31st of 1968. But it goes on, the Tet Offensive, generally speaking, goes on for probably a month or more. Some would argue, if any of you have seen a movie called Full Metal Jacket, that movie takes place in a town called Hue, H-U-E. And the PAVN will actually hold the city of Hue for 3 weeks until the Marines can finally take them out. And there's also a big battle that takes place near there called a place called Quezon, and that goes on for 77 days. So the Tet Offensive is not just a couple of days. I always say a couple of days because it took a couple of days to get them out of the main cities across South Vietnam.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I wanted to know the
Correct.
essay due on the 29th. It's not the extra credit one, right? It's a different one?
On the 29th is your essay. That's isn't that when that's due? I don't have my syllabus in front of me, but whatever the dates are in the syllabus is the way it is. Your essays are due at a certain time, and I have extra credit due at a certain time, and whatever the syllabus says is the way it is.
Yeah, the essay and the extra credit are both due on like the 29th. And I was wondering, they're two different things, right? Like, for sure?
Yes. Yes. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yes. Who are we? Ozahan? Ozahan?
Yes. So if I submitted the extra credit from the session, will I get a grade back?
Yeah, eventually. I have a lot to grade. What I will probably do is just enter them into Blackboard. And if you got the maximum you can earn is 4 points. And so if you sent me something that I'm grading and I give you all 4 points, it will show up as a 4. If you gave me one thing, it'll show up as a 2. If I'm giving you less points on either of those, it'll show up as less points or as a fraction of those points in an extra credit column.
Okay,
I probably won't send it back to you if you send it to me because I have a lot to grade. So I'll probably just put the number into Blackboard. And if you see a number there, it means that, and I don't know when I'll do that, but I will do that sometime. Sorry,
Okay.
I have a lot to grade, and see, I've got a lot more yet to grade because I'm sure a lot of you are going to send me film reviews. So I'll be doing those too. Okay.
I had a question.
Emily.
Can you explain the term Vietnamization one more time?
Okay, it means turning the war over to the Vietnamese. What we did is we actually increased the budget for weaponry. We increased the recruiting budget so they could recruit more soldiers. And the idea was we'll have them fight the war and we'll start bringing our men home. And we'll bring them home earlier. So men that were there for a year, like I was part of Vietnamization in that I was there for 1 year and they brought me home 11 days earlier than I would normally have been. The idea being we're going to turn the war over to our ally, the Vietnamese in the South. We'll help them with weaponry. We'll train them to fly helicopters. We'll bring them to America and train them to be good officers. We're going to turn it over to them. So we decide to do that in the middle of say 1 February of 1969, and we're out of there 4 years later. Completely out 4 years later. But in the meantime, we have to develop them as a better fighting front. More soldiers, we'll create some militias, we'll create some local regional forces, popular forces. Think of those as sort of air reserves and National Guard and militias and things like that. And we'll train them to take over their war. The silliness of it is we're going to Vietnamize the Vietnam War, which means that it was probably an American war if we're going to have to Vietnamize it, right? Anyone else?
Yes, sir.
Taylor.
Yes. So you said MLK was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on what day and year?
I think it's April 7. It's real close to that. If anyone has it, you can Google it and see exactly, but it's in the very beginning of April. I always tell my students the story about this because my memory of the assassination of Martin Luther King, and actually my memory of Lyndon Johnson's having decided not to run is kind of messed up in my mind because my little brother at the time was 16 years old and he was diagnosed with testicular cancer. And so I hardly remember any of that period of time. In reality, I don't remember much of it. Now, the good news was that he got over that and lived to be 66 years old, but tragically died just a couple of years ago. So that's my memory. I always share that story with my students. Anyone else?
Yes, I have one.
Emily.
Yes, you said the safest and secure place was attacked. What was that place called again?
Ask me again, please.
The safest and secure place was attacked. What place was that?
The United States Embassy in Saigon. The embassy is guarded by hundreds of military police. It was amazing. I mean, that they literally got in the wire and got into the building and actually were fighting clerks and typists. Yeah. Shocked everybody. Are you telling me that we're winning the war and the U.S. Embassy has the enemy in it? Shocked everybody. Anyone else?
Dr. Milam.
Yes.
I actually have a comment about the embassy during Tet. I worked on an interview for someone who was there during the Tet offensive, and he said they were fighting for about 12 hours. And Westy showed up, and the first thing he did was get after them for their uniforms not being squared away. And he said at that minute he knew they were going to lose the war.
Yeah, that's an interesting interview that you did, because I actually wrote about that in my book, that there was an officer there who was berated for not being in his starch fatigues. The other thing that Westy did that I was always against is I mentioned this the other day, he would go into the third evac hospital, which was the one in Saigon, and he was very upset that his nurses weren't wearing fatigues. I think I mentioned that the other day, that they weren't wearing the green, he didn't want them to wear the green fatigues. He wanted them to wear white uniforms and wear makeup and all that kind of stuff and look like women. And I've heard people say, I knew we were going to lose the war right then. So yeah, very true. Thank you for that, Sarah. Anyone else?
Yes, sir. It's me again.
Taylor, yes.
So you talked about the two men, Lee Duck. I don't know how to say his last name. Lee Duck.
T-H-O, Lee Duck.
And Henry Kissinger. So I just want to make sure what they did and what their roles were.
Yeah, they were negotiating the end of the war, and it took them about 5 years to negotiate it. And interestingly, they were both awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and Le Duc turned his down and turned down the money that went with it, because he said the war isn't over. And it wasn't over, because it ends for America's involvement in March of '73, which I'll be talking about on Thursday. But from his perspective, they hadn't met their goal of an independent Vietnam and a reunified Vietnam. So from his perspective, he hadn't accomplished anything. The other interesting thing about it is that the negotiations, you saw all those people around the table, all those people doing their job. But the truth of the matter was, Le Duc and Henry Kissinger were meeting on their own privately in a guy's house down the street. So, and they weren't even telling the world what they were doing. They were meeting privately.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyone else?
And then you mentioned a date, November, was it 1968 or 1969? You mentioned something about it and its significance, and I don't remember what you said.
Well, President Nixon was elected in November of 1968 and took office then in January 20th. He was elected in early November. I think that's all I mentioned. Oh, well, I also talked about General Westmoreland touring the United States in November and December of 1967. And in 1967, he was telling everyone that the war was going to be over because we were winning. That was 67. The November of 68 would have been the election of Richard Nixon.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yeah, Aaron, yes.
So was Vietnam like the first war that there's like an experience of the term like fragging, where there's like I guess, privates and corporals who would basically like throw a hand grenade into the officer's tent if they disagreed with the officer's decision or orders in that sense?
Well, the term fragging starts with Vietnam, but fragging, meaning killing an officer, goes all the way back to the days of Alexander the Great. There's a great story of Alexander the Great and having a battle with one of his men that tried to kill him. So it's always been there. But in Vietnam, with everybody having hand grenades available, the term fragging comes from fragmentation grenade, which is a grenade that has shrapnel on the inside of it. And it doesn't leave any fingerprints. And so you could roll a grenade underneath the cot of one of your officers or senior NCOs and get the hell out of there, and he's dead, and it's hard to find out who did it. And so fragging becomes a term that is used. The act of killing your seniors, it doesn't start with Vietnam, but the term fragging does, okay? Now I've written about that also in my book. I think it's in chapter 6, as I recall. And what I found is that the targets were usually senior NCOs rather than junior officers or even field grade officers. It was about lifers. It was about those men who were, and it usually wasn't about sending men into combat. It was sending men to do ship details back in the rear. I just spent 2 weeks in the field, and now I'm in the rear, and now I'm trying to relax, and you're making me go out here and empty the latrine. It was those kinds of things that really got guys upset, and they were being told to do that by lifers, meaning men who were going to make a career. They're 35 years old, they're 45 years old, and they're not going into the field the way the 25-year-old guy is. So, but yeah, fragging was, I don't want to say it's common, but it happened, yes. Anyone else? If you're interested in this stuff, I will be teaching the course called The Vietnam War. It's a History 3330, and I will be teaching it in the spring of 2022, 1 year from now, in Holden Hall 104. I usually have 150 students, and then taking that course and getting a good grade in it and applying gives you the opportunity to go to Vietnam with me then the following summer, and we spend 30 days in Vietnam, and you earn 6 credit hours of history. Good stuff. All right. Hey, listen, I appreciate you staying with me here. I will see you all on Thursday. We'll wrap up this war, and we'll go on to probably civil rights and the end of the Cold War, then the following couple of lectures. Okay? See y'all.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're the best, Uncle
Bye.
Walter.
Have a good day.
Thank you.